Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD, pro physique athlete. Today we're going to be talking about 10 of the worst training mistakes when it comes to bodybuilding. You'll see a lot of misinformation out there coming from fitness influencers, pro bodybuilders, and even people who claim that they're science-based. And sometimes these people can be really compelling, but today we're going to be dispelling a bunch of those myths. I'll be talking about some of the most common mistakes I see people making in terms of their training knowledge, as well as some mistakes that I made when I was a beginner. One of the most common mistakes people make when it comes to training is thinking that more is better. This often comes in the form of talking about training volume, but also training intensity in terms of effort, so going to failure and beyond. There's this blood and guts culture in bodybuilding where people make it seem like you want to do more and that pushing your body to the extreme limit is what's going to get you results. Now the thing is, a lot of bodybuilders have had success with this kind of approach because of the mindset. When you look deeper, you realize it's actually the dedication and consistency that make them successful. But that doesn't necessarily mean the way they trained was optimal. The way I like to think about these training variables is that frequency, volume, and intensity interact with each other in order to produce stimulus. Now it's important to think of these variables together because they affect each other. That is, for one given person, if you jack up intensity really high, at some point volume is going to have to come down. If you have a lot of volume, you may need more frequency to help distribute it. And if you train very intensely, you may need to back off on the frequency because you'll be really sore. These three components combine to give you your overall stimulus. And each person will require a different amount of stimulus, which will also change throughout your training career. There's also going to be some optimal combination of these three variables that is going to work best for you. So people often ask me exactly how many sets they should be doing or what RIR they should be training at. And I can give some broad stroke suggestions of where to start, and you can start off on one of my programs, but ultimately you need to figure out this equation for your own body. And at some point, if you keep increasing one of these variables, you're going to have diminishing returns and eventually even suboptimal results. Next mistake that people make when it comes to bodybuilding training is prioritizing weight over technique. You've all heard how progressive overload is key for hypertrophy, and this is the key driver of hypertrophy, but it can't come at the expense of technique. People often get into the groove of following a specific progression protocol, for example, linear progression or double progression, and at some point they can't keep up with that rate of progress, but they try and drive the weights up anyways, and they end up compromising their lifting form. Do not fall into this trap. Make sure you learn good technique at the beginning and make sure that stays constant as you progress in weight. Remember, true progression only occurs when you lift more weight using the same technique. When you mess up on form, you're not going to properly target the intended muscle. And you also put yourself at risk for acute and chronic injuries. Next mistake that people make in the gym is changing programs all the time. Program hopping is really common, especially when pro bodybuilders talk about muscle confusion and because people want to chase after the new shiny thing. Remember that muscle growth is a complicated process and it takes time with progressive overload. In fact, it usually takes around at least 3 months for you to see the results of any change you made in your training programming. So for example, if I implement a new training technique or exercise, I'll usually keep it in for at least a few months until I decide to change it. That is, assuming that I feel a good stimulus in that muscle when I'm actually training it. Think about baking a cake. You put all the ingredients together and put it in the oven, but then you have to wait and let it bake. And you don't know how well it turned out until you actually take it out of the oven when it's done and taste it. Think about training in hypertrophy the same way. You put together a training program and then you run it for a few months and see if it actually works. Next mistake when it comes to hypertrophy training is missing out on range of motion. This is a really common one I see in the gym where people just don't take advantage of the full range of motion of the exercise they're using. Common examples would be not going all the way down to touch your chest on a bench press, not squatting to at least parallel, or stopping before the bottom in curls. I want you to think about the range of motion like a multiplier of your volume. You'll hear me say that training volume is a very important variable when it comes to hypertrophy. You can look at training volume as sets times reps times weight lifted, but the other part that you also need to multiply is range of motion. You can boil this down to looking at volume as the total amount of work performed. And when you look at the physics equation for work, you need to look at the distance actually traveled. So this is where range of motion comes into play. Now, when talking about the range of motion, you particularly don't want to be missing out on the mid and end range of motion. There is starting to be some research coming out suggesting that the end or stretched range of motion is going to be helpful for hypertrophy. This is why you'll see me always trying to include at least one stretch type exercise for each muscle group in my programs. A big mistake I see people make in the gym when it comes to lifting tempo is not controlling the eccentric. Remember how we were talking about range of motion and how the distance mattered? Well, you can look at distance from the perspective of the concentric and eccentric as well. If you're just dropping things on the eccentric, you're losing out on that volume. In terms of precise lifting tempos, I don't think it has to be super slow, because if your lifting tempo gets slow enough, you could just do more reps. But you want to be going at a tempo where you know that you're at least controlling the eccentric. A 1 or 2 second eccentric is going to be enough for this. This is another big pet peeve of mine that I see in the gym, and it's wasting time on isolation and small muscle groups. Now don't get me wrong, isolation work is great, but especially if you're a beginner or if you're short on time, you're going to want to focus on your main heavy compound movements. A lot of people don't have the time to train 4 or 5 times per week and actually get in sufficient volume to train all of their muscle groups well. When looking at things from this lens, it makes sense that you want to choose exercises that will give you the most bang for your buck in terms of total amount of muscle involved. Now you'll see pro bodybuilders really trying to isolate specific muscle groups. The reasons why this works for them is because first of all, they have the time to really include all of the fancy stuff that they want. And they're so strong at an advanced level that a lot of those big heavy compounds would generate a disproportionate amount of fatigue. If, for example, you're only training 2 or 3 times per week, you probably wouldn't want a program that's solely built off of leg extensions, leg curls, cable flies, and straight arm pull downs. The other part to this is focusing on small muscle groups that may not need direct training. Some examples of this are traps, anterior delts, rear delts, and forearms. These muscle groups tend to get trained pretty well with other compound movements. Traps get trained with shoulder and back movements. Rear delts get trained with pulling movements, and anterior delts get trained with pushing movements. And forearms tend to get trained well with arm training. And it's not that it's a bad thing to train these muscle groups directly, it's just that a lot of people don't have enough time in the gym to spend on them. I see a lot of people focusing on isolation rear delt training when they should really be doing more heavy rows. Okay, next hypertrophy training mistake people make is not having a system for progression. Remember, progressive overload is king in bodybuilding, and there are a few ways you can go about it. In general, I recommend that you choose a system that allows you to progress as quickly as possible in a sustainable fashion. Some methods for doing this includes a linear progression, which means you're increasing one variable at a time, usually weight. So for example, you just add weight every session or every week, while keeping sets and reps constant. Then you have double progression, which means you have 2 variables that you change in an alternating fashion. Let's say we're talking about the 6 to 10 rep range using easy bar curls as our example. Start with 3x6 with 50 pounds, then you add a rep every workout till you get to 10 reps, and you come back down to 6 reps, and then increase the weight to 55 pounds. Next, you have wave loading progression, which means you come down in reps while coming up in weight. Say going from 10 to 8 to 6 reps with increasing weight as you go, and then you come back to 10 reps with higher weight. And finally, this triple progression where you change the sets, reps, and weight, and progress these through the mesocycle. The way you progress will change as you become more advanced, but in general, you do want to have some sort of system just to make sure that you are making progress. I see so many people just coming in day out and using the same weights and the same exercises all the time, and eventually your progress is going to plateau like that. Coming on to the topic of exercise selection, one of the mistakes people make in terms of choosing their exercises for muscle growth is low overload ceiling movements. The overload ceiling is basically how heavily you could load that movement if you were to get really strong. Let's talk about tricep press downs here as an example. If you were to compare a standard cable press down with 2 arms against a single arm reverse press down, the standard cable press down has a higher overload ceiling. That is, you have a higher potential for going heavy. The single arm reverse press down may give you a nice little pump, but as you get stronger, eventually you're going to get to the point where the instability of the movement is going to limit you. So you really want to be choosing exercises that are going to allow you to get really strong in them. Here's a mistake you see a lot of people make with their hypertrophy training when you look at the programs, is only using the same rep range. In bodybuilding, you'll see that a lot of people are married to the 8 to 12 rep range. And this rep range actually does have a lot of benefits because it's a good trade-off between the amount of fatigue you're producing to the amount of stimulus that you get. But I do recommend having a broad range of rep ranges in your program. The idea is that you're going to have a bit more complete stimulation of your muscle fibers if you do so. For the most part, I recommend having most of your training around 2/3 of your training volume in the 6 to 12 rep range, and then 1/3 of your training volume outside of that rep range. There is research showing that we can get good hypertrophy from anywhere from 1 to 30 reps, as long as you're training within about 4 reps of failure. For practical reasons, most of your training should probably fall between 5 to 20 reps. But for any given muscle group in my training programs, you'll usually see that I choose one main heavy movement that I program in lower rep ranges like 5 to 8, and then I have my lighter rep ranges like 10 to 15 and 12 to 20. Notice that the optimal rep range will change depending on the exercise as well as the individual. Your main compound movements are going to be better suited to lower rep ranges and higher weights. If, for example, you try to do squats for sets of 20, you might run into so much metabolic and global fatigue that you may not get that great of a quad stimulus before just burning out in general. On the other hand, if you try to take a bicep curl really heavy in the 3 to 5 rep range, you'd probably be creating a lot of unnecessary stress on your tendons. The 10th mistake people make when it comes to training is not following Dr. Swole. Just kidding, but actually smash that like button if you haven't. But the one I want to talk about here is not following the right influencers. As I said in the beginning, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it can be tricky in fitness because people might look like they have really great physiques, but they got there because of their genetics and or performance enhancing drugs. If you're natural, you really want to be looking at who has had really good success naturally. Getting to know people in the evidence-based sphere is also going to help. You can always look at the guests I've had on my podcast if you're looking for somewhere to start. So those are 10 training mistakes that I see people making in the gym. What should be number 11? Let us know in the comments. If you want to learn some advanced training techniques for hypertrophy, check out this video where I talk about hypertrophy periodization. This is basically the manipulation of training variables over long periods of time, like across the whole calendar year, to really optimize your progress. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't make mistake number 10, and we'll see you next time.